Welcome to this webinar, Intro to the ArcGIS Platform, Part 4, Information Architecture. As a note, this webinar is being recorded and the recording and transcript will be available in a few days. Next slide, please. I'm Annabelle Lee Enriquez, and I will be taking part in the Q&A at the end of this session, along with my colleague, David Myers. But today, the main presenter will be Dennis Withrich, CEO of Fairlawn Geographics, the lead developers of the ArcGIS platform. So without further ado, I'll pass it along to Dennis.
Thanks, Annabelle. And welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be for you. Appreciate you joining us today. Our conversation today will be about the ArcGIS platform, and in particular, the information architecture for ArcGIS. It's the fourth in our Introduction to ArcGIS Platform webinar series. And I'm going to assume that you've had a chance to see the previous webinars, which have been recorded and are available on the arcgisproject.org website. You'll find in those webinars I think, relatively comprehensive summary of specific aspects of ArcGIS. And I'm going to presume that you are familiar with some of our core terminology and that you've got a basic familiarity with ArcGIS in today's conversation. For today, I'd like to focus our conversation on really, I think, a core concept here, which is how ArcGIS manages its information, and particularly why we've architected ArcGIS the way we have. I guess I'll jump to the end a little bit and say it's really an attempt to make it as easy as possible to be good stewards of your resources. Our webinar today will look at the details of ArcGIS information architecture. We really want to focus on some real examples, and we'll definitely reserve some time at the end for questions. But before we dive in, I'd just like to make sure we're all on the same footing here and to remind you all of the aim of ArcGIS. In other words, why did the Getty Conservation Institute and World Monuments Fund really consider building a software data management application like ArcGIS? And ultimately, the real reason, the rationale for building ArcGIS was to make it possible for you to be better stewards of your cultural heritage resources, particularly as the conditions around us change. And this is my little summary definition of the ArcGIS ambition. You'll notice here that I've got a little asterisk next to cultural, and that's going to turn out to be kind of important, and we'll come back to that shortly, but keep that in mind. If you've seen our previous webinars, or you've heard us talk about ArcGIS, likely this slide will look familiar to you, and it's our attempt in a pretty pithy way to show you what we think of as the really kind of essential parts of ArcGIS. It's got data management capabilities built into it, data search, discovery, and visualization capabilities, and even what we call task management. And hopefully in looking at the previous webinars, most of these concepts make sense to you. And it's a pretty ambitious application, and it's trying to do a lot. And really for today, I'd like to answer the question, well, given this ambitious set of capabilities for ArcGIS, really, how do we do it? And this is the crux of why I wanted to spend some time talking about the information architecture of the application, and really why you might be interested in understanding it. This will give you a better understanding of not only how ArcGIS manages data, but why it does so and what its implications are for you. So without further ado, let's jump into that conversation. Probably the most important thing to get out of today's talk is the basic building blocks of the ArcGIS software. And it starts with something we refer to internally as ArcGIS core, or often we'll call it the ArcGIS platform. And this is sort of the foundation or the underlying set of capabilities for the software. This is where ArcGIS implements some of the key things it's supposed to do. So things like creating, supporting read and update and delete capabilities for data, data import and export in bulk, data indexing into search engine, search and discovery tools. ArcGIS GIS capabilities are part of the core, and the security model for ArcGIS is all part of the core platform. This is sort of the underpinnings of the software. On top of that, we have some key pillars of the software, and you can see them sort of listed here, at least the most essential ones. The data models are really ArcGIS support for dynamically defining essentially the database contents that you want to manage, all the content necessary for you to manage your resources. The RDM is shorthand for the Reference Data Manager, which is ArcGIS built-in thesaurus and controlled vocabulary module. Functions are a way to implement custom logic for managing your data. Geospatial services are the services, especially the GIS services, that ArcGIS exposes both to its internal modules and to external systems. And then its API, or Application Programming Interface, which is a key way in which we integrate ArcGIS with other systems. And on top of these pillars, we've got several additional items. And we'll talk about these in today's conversation. So plugins, workflows, and integrations. And we'll have a good look at each of those. On top of all of those is the ArcGIS user interface. And off to the right here, we can see the API sort of spanning all these things. The API, or the Application Programming Interface, is used in large part to power all these different aspects of ArcGIS. Really, the key point that I'd like to make in today's talk is that if you need a mental model for how ArcGIS manages information, how ArcGIS is architected, you could do way worse than thinking about a Lego set. And this is actually, I think, a pretty useful metaphor. Legos are designed as modules, bricks that snap together and really allow you to build models based on the extent of your imagination. You can use Legos to build many, many things. And ArcGIS is in many ways kind of like that for data management. And that's really kind of the key concept for today's conversation. For those of you in a hurry, this is when we can ride off into the sunset. Really, if there's one thing to remember, it's that ArcGIS is designed in a modular way. And that's kind of the essence of today's conversation. Of course, there is a little bit more to the story. And that's the idea that, yeah, it's great if somebody gives you a Lego set, but you still have to build it. And often what we care about is not having to build something from scratch, but being able to take advantage of a pre-built application. And we have that concept in ArcGIS. We call them packages. And in essence, packages are really, you can think of them as really pre-built Lego kits, but for data management. ArcGIS packages are applications that implement design ideas by a designer. And I've chosen this example, this little Millennium Falcon example here, not only because it's a cool model, but because it actually visually shows some of the ideas that I'd like to talk about, at least in analogy. There are all sorts of custom little bricks in this model, things that come off at odd angles and with odd shapes, and yet they still snap into place. And that's that's a theme that I'd like to explore in today's conversation. So packages or applications in the ArcGIS world are much like these custom Lego bricks, and they define the models, the code that presents data, both as data reports or data templates, also as data visualizations, and even a custom user interface in the form of plugins and workflows. And ultimately, these applications can be used to drive integrations between ArcGIS and other information management systems. So let's take a closer look at this idea. And I'd like to start really with this idea of data models, or really the databases that we implement on top of the ArcGIS core platform. If we take a closer look, data models are themselves made up of modules or components. So data models, these databases, also define the data entry forms, or cards as we call them, that are deployed in an ArcGIS application. And cards themselves, these data entry forms themselves, collect or expose kind of core data types and the user interface elements or data widgets necessary to interact with the database. Cards also can define report templates, so how data are presented on screen, and are also where we define permissions. So the security model is built directly into the database. So let's take a look at what the implications of this information architecture are. And I'd like to start with a real world example here. This is a package that we call ArcGIS HER, which is short for Heritage Environment Record, or Historical Environment Record. And it's an application built primarily for managing cultural heritage in Great Britain. This is a key thing that the Brits do, I think, really exceptionally well. They've got mandated requirements to manage their cultural heritage resources, and we're working very closely with Historic England to create a package, an application that can be used throughout Great Britain to manage cultural heritage resources. And a big part of that application really resolves down to a set of pre-built models, a set of databases that define the content of this particular application. In the case of ArcGIS HER, there's something like 14 or 15 different models in place, and they've been defined based on the content or the information necessary to describe cultural heritage in accordance with the legal framework of England. And they include many of the models, they include many of the things that you might imagine. So models meant to keep track of investigation activities, or archival sources, or heritage areas, or heritage assets. These are delivered as part of this application, and in fact represent quite a high degree of intellectual effort. They really encapsulate a lot of thinking. And one of the key things about models is that they're transferable, they are freely available, and they provide you with a lot of thinking. In fact, I've got a little video here that I'd like to roll that shows you some of the aspects of a model. So to get you oriented here, first on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a tree here that shows sort of the key high-level data themes for this model. And on the right are configuration forms. So let me start this little video up here. And you can see, in this case, we're looking at a heritage asset model with a set of metadata. And now we've expanded this database tree to show you just how sophisticated and how detailed this particular model is. I'm going to look for a particular member of this model, in this case, geospatial coordinates, and show you how the ArcGIS model describes sort of key information about the content of a database. The details here are less important. The key thing I want you to get from this is that once this model has been designed and deployed in ArcGIS, it's freely available to anyone who wants to use it. And in this case, if part of your mandate is to manage heritage assets or heritage resources, you can take this model as a starting point. Once you've got that model in place, a couple things become really important. One is, how do you interact with the model? How do you interact with the database? And an essential idea here is that ArcGIS automatically creates data entry forms based on the model that you've designed, which means that without having to write a single line of code, you can already deploy not only a database, but all the forms necessary to interact with that database. And here's an example of a default data entry form. And I think I've got a video here that I'd like to show you. And really the thing to keep track of here is the ability to take this automatically created data entry form and configure it for your specific use. So I'm going to run this video here and watch what we do here. We identify a particular element or field in the form. We can change the way it presents its data. We can change the order of these data widgets in a form. We can update labeling to match the specific requirements of your data editing team. The idea here is that without really doing any coding at all, you can take these default forms and tailor them to your specific requirements. And that's a handy thing. Let's take a step back here and review kind of what ArcGIS delivers out of the box. So ArcGIS already provides, I would say, a relatively rich set of data types and data widgets in which to build your database models. This is a really sort of a quick summary of the data types that come bundled into the core ArcGIS. But what if you need a data type that we haven't already created? Well, one of the things that we've done is we've documented, in essence, how to build your own Lego bricks. In sort of more precise language, what we've done is we've defined and documented the specific steps necessary to create your own data types and your own data widgets for inclusion in ArcGIS. And it's basically exactly like this. If you know the dimensions of a Lego brick and the way they're snapped together, you can create your own Lego brick. And we can do the same thing digitally with ArcGIS. And let's take a look at that. I actually have a specific example here. This is a data type that the folks at Historic England identified as a requirement for their ArcGIS HER package. It happens to be something called the British National Grid reference. And essentially what they do in Britain is tie the location of their cultural heritage assets to this sophisticated gridding system here. This is just one view at one scale, but essentially what they want to do is keep track of a grid reference when they enter information into ArcGIS. The approach to supporting that was to build a British National Grid data type and a British National Grid data widget. And you can see an example of that here. What it essentially does is it lets you enter a real-world coordinate in one of several coordinate systems, and the data type is responsible for converting that into the appropriate British National Grid. The idea here is this is quite a specific requirement. It's quite a specific data type. Probably don't care about this if you aren't in Great Britain, but the Brits do. And so they can take ArcGIS and make the exact data type that they need. Now I've been talking about modularity, and key point here is that cards themselves are also modular. So you can take cards and extend them to your own needs. And here's an example. Let's take a look at how you can use custom cards to update the way data are presented on screen. So I've got a little video here that I'll run. What we're looking at here is a default data entry card. This is a card that shows a bunch of data elements that are just presented one after the other. We're going to use a custom card, or in this case, a map card. And what this map card does is alter the way in which the data elements are presented on screen, provides a way of defining or configuring the specifics of the card, everything from default location and base map through the order in which the various data elements are presented. So the key point here is cards are a way for you to customize the way in which you allow people access to your data entry forms. And in fact, there's more to it than that. You can actually do some pretty interesting things with cards. Here's an example of a card that extends the basic data entry effort to include some spatial analysis. So let me start my video here. And what you'll see is a case where a data editor is entering the location of a investigation. So they're going to add a point here, and I'll stop there. So they've added a point, and what they're going to do now, ultimately what they need to do is figure out all the cultural heritage resources that are within a certain distance of this point. And you could certainly do that manually, but this card has been extended to support some spatial analysis, where what they're going to do here is buffer that location and then automatically find all the cultural heritage resources that fall within that buffer zone. And here you see that they're displayed on the map. These are the various members of the different models that fall within that area. And this card has identified them, presented them on screen, and then automatically added them as related resources to this particular investigation location. So that's an example of extending the card to do some automated work for you. And then for those who want to do even more, you can really do, again, kind of as your imagination allows, some very interesting things. Here's an example of a card that allows you to drag and drop a spreadsheet onto this map, and in doing so, validate the contents of that spreadsheet, create new records in ArcGIS, and automatically connect them to this record. So let's run this little video. And you can see that I'm going to drag and drop a spreadsheet, and ArcGIS uploads that spreadsheet, does some data validation to ensure that the contents are correct. Here's an example where there's a problem with that record. We could go in and fix it, or just review it later. We can review these records before importing, and when we're happy, import all the contents of that spreadsheet, automatically create new entries in ArcGIS, automatically connect them to this resource, and then I can go ahead and jump to the newly created record and continue to edit it, or at least review it and edit it if necessary. So what we're seeing here now is a quick review of a record in that spreadsheet that I uploaded. So the bottom line here is cards are meant to be a way of giving you a lot of flexibility over not only what, but how to process data. Which brings me back to this point about resources. Now, I started the conversation by saying that ArcGIS is about managing cultural heritage resources, but in actual fact, ArcGIS information architecture really allows you to at least consider the idea of managing resources beyond the cultural heritage field. And in fact, that's what we're doing. I mean, really, ArcGIS is about managing resources in a much more broadly used sense of the term. And let's take a quick look at what's possible. Here's a package an ArcGIS package specifically built to manage natural resources. So plants, the location and observations of plants and animals, ecosystems that might be at risk, basically the natural world's version of cultural heritage. We're currently building a package in partnership with the Getty to manage conservation science data. These are resources that are all about objects, works of art, sampling of those works of art, and the digital data that are derived from sampling works of art. So this is a package really meant to manage digital information. Here's another example of ArcGIS driving an application. In this case, ArcGIS is being used, a package in ArcGIS is being used to manage the metadata for a large collection of images. And it's really in the background here, and it's providing its data to a completely custom front end that allows you to explore, in this case, the imagery associated with Sunset Strip in Los Angeles over the years from, I think, the 60s through the 80s. And then finally, you can build packages for ArcGIS that really have nothing to do with cultural heritage or natural resources. This is an example of a package that we're building to support the management, tracking water and wastewater usage and how they're related to parcel ownership, property ownership, and how to bill for the water and wastewater services that you receive. That's a really quick tour of the kinds of things you can do with packages. We are starting to build a library of packages, and as packages come online, you'll see them referenced at this location. It's a way, if you're interested, to see who's working on ArcGIS and in what capacity. The key idea here is that packages and all the custom data types and models and data entry forms that they encapsulate can be freely accessed and used for your own purposes. So that's all cool, but really, ultimately, we use ArcGIS to work with data. And I'd like to maybe now transition our conversation to what you can do specifically with data and ArcGIS. And that is essentially going to be a conversation about how we can take advantage of ArcGIS modular architecture to build very specific user interface elements and data processing tasks and integrations between ArcGIS and other systems. And let's start with a simple example. So right out of the tin, ArcGIS will provide you with some core reporting services. And here's an example. This is actually from the ArcGIS for Science package. So this is a specific example of a physical thing. It's a work of art. In fact, it's a piece of furniture. And in this example, this particular piece of furniture has several names, it has several statements, and you can see that this default report is capable of showing all that information. It might not be pretty, but it works. Of course, you might have some very specific ideas about how you want to present the information about your resources. Often, organizations have quite clear ideas about how they want to present data, how they want the formats of the reports to appear. And here's an example of what you can do. You can build in custom reports. In this example, we're using an approach that attempts to group content about a physical thing into themes. And in this case, one theme is a theme of naming and classifying a work of art. And you can see here that it's quite a different display than what we saw previously, up to and including the way in which we present and use screen real estate to show things like names. So there's a lot that can be done here. Essentially, we're back to, if you can imagine it, you can build it. There are a number of places in which we think about presenting information to a user in ArcGIS. And I've got a little video here to show one way in which report and report templates can also be leveraged. So I'm going to run this little video here, and you'll see that in this package, we can identify an element, this case, a water account, and show some basic information about it. So by default, ArcGIS is intelligent enough to know kind of what to show a user when they're looking for a summary of information in the search interface. But what if you have some very specific ideas about what should be shown to a user? In this example, we've identified a model, in this case, the parcel model, and decided that we want to show some very specific information about each one of these parcels. In this example, we're showing the number of water accounts and businesses associated with this parcel, water usage, water billing, and this is an example of extending ArcGIS default reporting templates to really be able to show the exact information that a user would need to see when they're looking at this case for parcel information. It doesn't just stop there. I've been talking about reports and report templates and how that can let you, it basically gives you the flexibility of deciding what you want to show in a report to your user, but it doesn't end there. ArcGIS supports a thing we call plugins, and plugins are custom user interface that allow you to create very specific, very tailored experiences for your user base. This is an example of a plugin that does a couple things. Well, it really does several things. And let's get you oriented. Off to the left here is a panel that has as a custom data entry form, and it would allow a user to create or update new information about a bill. Off to the right here is essentially a custom report that shows the results of a billing calculation. This plugin allows a user to make changes to the billing parameters, the input to a bill, automatically run a new calculation, and then update the database automatically with the results of that calculation. So quite a sophisticated plugin that actually looks pretty simple, but does a lot of work in the background for the user. Here's another example of how you can take advantage of ArcGIS to provide custom data presentation to your users. This is an example in which we've integrated ArcGIS with a dashboarding system to aggregate information across multiple models and display it in a number of different ways. So aggregating, in this case, water bills, showing the location of billed parcels, an aggregation and statistical analysis of the kinds of water users there are in this particular basin, and the charges based on different kinds of types of users. This is the kind of thing that is super flexible. And if you're thinking, well, why would I care about this? I care about cultural heritage resources. Let me just say that there's some analogs here in place. And this is a way of aggregating information about the content of your ArcGIS package in a real-time way so that you can do statistical analysis and presentation in real time to your user community. Finally, I'd like to at least have a nod towards workflows. We've spoken about these in the past, but essentially what workflows are a way of implementing more sophisticated data entry tasks, probably multi-step data entry tasks that require a user to complete a series of data entry forms in order to fully and completely enter valid data. We've touched on this in previous webinars, and it's actually sort of a topic unto itself. So for today, I'll just leave it there and direct you back to one of the webinars on the archisproject.org site that goes into this in a bit more detail. I'd like to really turn our attention now towards how we can use ArcGIS and the ArcGIS architecture to do some interesting things, and in particular, how the architecture allows ArcGIS to integrate with other systems. And I have a specific example in mind that I'd like to discuss, and that is a real-time integration between ArcGIS and Esri's GIS technology platform. In particular, we've built an integration between ArcGIS and Esri that allows ArcGIS to publish native Esri feature services. And apologies for the jargon, but if you're a GIS person, that probably means something to you, so that you can use a completely different technology. That is to say, Esri's technology to access, edit, and create ArcGIS data in real time, but within ArcGIS Pro. And I'd like to maybe pause for a moment and ask why you would want to do this before showing you the software. So why would this even be interesting? Why would this be the kind of thing that might make sense? And let me pose an example here. Let's suppose that you've got an ArcGIS package running in the cloud. Let's say it's based in London, and you have a distributed team doing cultural heritage resource management. Perhaps you've got some folks in Amman working on field data collection, and they're using a cell phone or a mobile device, an ArcGIS collector, to manage the collection of information. Folks in Amman might actually just be interested in doing an initial survey of information. Let's say they've gone out and they're looking at a survey of potentially important cultural resources such as buildings. With their cell phone, they can walk up to a building, maybe draw up a point on a map, define the condition of the building, and take a picture, and synchronize that to the ArcGIS package back in London. Once that happens, a GIS person in Oxford can take that exact information, look at it inside the ArcGIS Pro environment, decide that they have a better geometric representation of the building. Perhaps they want to replace that point with the actual outline of the building. And they also want to run a geoprocessing task to determine the potential risk of that building. Maybe it finds itself in a particularly high-risk area, for example. Once that's done, another person using the ArcGIS web application, and potentially located in Cairo, might take that information contributed by the Esri user, look at the risk factor, and decide that it warrants a high protection grade. As these data are synced back and forth, all the members of the team, even those in the field, can get access to the latest information. So the idea here is that people with the right tools are doing the right thing and progressively enhancing the quality and content of the ArcGIS database. So with that as at least an example of how you might use this, let's take a quick look at how this actually works. So I've got a video here that shows ArcGIS and Esri working in conjunction with one another. So let me get this started here. And I'll start with getting you oriented. So you're looking at a map inside of ArcGIS Pro, and ArcGIS data are these greenish dots and bluish polygons that represent the location of what we call a consultation. You can think of this as the location of a building permit application. So in a sense, they represent sort of investigations about the location of a potential redevelopment. So the idea here is the green points and the blue polygons are ArcGIS data, and they're presented in this map as native Esri feature services. Inside this particular organization, there's local data too. And these red polygons represent building outlines, so building footprints from an internal organizational geodatabase. So we're literally looking at one map that's showing both ArcGIS data in real time and Esri data in real time. So what we're going to do here is log on to an ArcGIS server and ensure that we have editing privileges. So we've done that. And notice what happens now. We've enabled the ability to edit a resource or create a new resource inside of ArcGIS. So we'll click on this Edit Resource button. And what it'll do is give us the opportunity to identify one of the ArcGIS resources. And we're going to look at this little dot here that represents a consultation location. And that consultation location is ArcGIS data. And we're going to select it. And once we've selected it, we'll register it. And what we see right away is that ArcGIS returns some basic information about this particular resource instance. And once we've selected it, I'm going to come in here and select a geometry from within the building footprint data set, which is a non-ArcGIS data set. And once I do that, I'll upload it and get confirmation. Do I want to upload that data into ArcGIS? I do. And notice what happens here. After this upload, our representation of this ArcGIS element changes from a point to a polygon. And at this point, I can access that specific record and actually load ArcGIS directly into ArcGIS here. You can see that our geometry has been uploaded, and now I can interact with the record inside the ArcGIS editor, which is itself embedded inside the Esri ArcGIS Pro application in a very native way. So this is an example of being able to integrate ArcGIS in quite an intimate and sophisticated way within another application. Which brings me to the point where we should start to put our toys away here and talk about what we've learned today. Really, my point today was to make the argument that ArcGIS is really an application platform, a data management platform that's designed to let you do a better job of preserving and protecting your resources, even if they're quite complicated. The argument is that ArcGIS information architecture lets you rapidly create applications, often quite sophisticated applications that do a really good job of managing data in a way that help you ensure that you're making informed decisions that lead to impactful actions for actually preserving and protecting your resources. And in an ethos that I think is well-timed in a world with limited resources, the real point here is ArcGIS lets you take your limited resources and apply them in an intelligent way, really to use your resources to build out applications that are able to meet your specific requirements and demands. Ultimately, the real benefit of understanding the information architecture in ArcGIS is that it puts you in a position to build software and deploy software that meets your requirements, your actual real world processes, your business objectives, instead of the other way around. With that, I will thank you for staying with me through what's probably a pretty dense and not necessarily super sexy topic, and open it up for questions. So thank you very much. Annabelle, thanks for managing our conversation today. And let's see if there are any questions out there.
And thank you, Dennis. As a reminder for this Q&A session, if you have any question about the content of this webinar or really any other question about Arches, you can enter your question using the Q&A feature, and David and I will be moderating the questions. You can also upvote any questions in the Q&A to let us know that you also have the same question. We hope to get to all of the questions today, so let's get started. David, do we have a question to start with?
We do. We have one from Salim, and he's asking, could you please comment on the types and scales of organizations that have used or are interested in using Arches? What main challenges these organizations faced through their feedback to Arches? What kind of expertise these organizations have developed in adopting Arches? So I can take a first pass at that. So in terms of the types of organizations, one category would be public agencies, government agencies, and I think they range from national authorities like a Historic England or those in Jamaica, Barbados, Jersey, Isle of Man. There are also several cities like City of Los Angeles and City of Lincoln in the UK, and other cities are in the process of implementing. And then there are also some NGOs, like national NGOs involved in the implementations, and also in Barbados and Jamaica, or others. And a number of also academic institutions are involved in projects. I can think of, for instance, some Arcadia funded projects. Would you, Annabelle or Dennis, add anything to that? There's a question of expertise and maybe challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as Dennis mentioned earlier, one of the great things about Arches is that you can do so many things with it, but what comes with that is that there are a lot of choices to be made with Arches, and so a lot of those choices require some technical expertise, not just in regards to the technology of Arches, but also in the domain expertise and for the project, as well as knowledge organization. So organizations that are seeking to implement Arches, they would need to find that sort of expertise to bring to their project team. Alternatively, Arches has a list of service providers that organizations can hire to implement Arches for them. And that is usually something that happens primarily at the front end with the start of an Arches implementation. But once Arches is set up, it's relatively easy to maintain moving forward. Dennis, did you want to add to that?
I think you both covered it pretty well. I'll just add a little practical point, which is Arches is like most other enterprise data management systems. So whether you're talking about Esri GIS or Microsoft databases or Oracle applications, technology of that scale usually requires someone with some expertise to implement and customize. And you can develop those skills in-house if you want. There's a lot of training opportunities for technologists to master Arches, or as Annabelle suggested, there are a lot of service providers out there that can help with deploying Arches.
All right. Next question. Thanks very much for the informative presentation. How much of the technology used to integrate Arches with ArcGIS Pro can be reused to integrate Arches with QGIS? Dennis, that seems like a good one for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the bottom line is a good chunk of what we learned in integrating Arches with Esri is directly applicable to QGIS. And in fact, in some ways, integrating ArcGIS with QGIS would be a bit easier because of some of the technical capabilities that QGIS offers. And for example, QGIS supports native GeoJSON services, and ArcGIS supports native GeoJSON services. The bottom line here is that you could have quite a similar pattern for integrating ArcGIS with QGIS. That is to say, accessing ArcGIS data in real time, identifying an ArcGIS feature inside of QGIS, and then opening up the ArcGIS editor to update that updated ArcGIS feature based on some of the same high quality geospatial data processing tools that QGIS offers. So hopefully that was not too jargony, but the bottom line is a lot of what we learned for the Esri integration is really immediately and directly applicable to QGIS.
Great. So our next question is from Brett Ferguson. Do you have an idea of when some of the packages you showed today might be available on the ArcGIS packages page? Some of the templates / plugins would be great, really great to start from when trying to build a package. I agree with you, Brett. And I think we don't have an exact date on when some of those packs. So I'm assuming you are talking about the ArcGIS HER package and as well as the ArcGIS for Science package that Dennis showed, and I think there may be some other packages, but in regards to those, we don't have an exact date, but they are coming soon, hopefully within the year.
I would just say that the ArcGIS HER package and should be available. I would say the time frame is this summer. And the DISCO package, certainly this year.
DISCO meaning ArcGIS for Science.
Correct, yeah, sorry.
That's right, no worries.
There's a little internal code word there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we will, this is also a reminder to definitely sign up for our announcement list as well as on any of our social media channels, because when those packages are launched on that page, we will definitely announce that.
And also on our community forum as well.
Yes.
Next question from Masood. Hello all, thanks for the presentation. This is a related question, I think. I have a question on the packages examples you provided, especially the digital photo collection and the GCI Science project. Can you say more about them? Does ArcGIS, or can it be used also for non-georeference map-free cultural heritage data? Dennis?
Yeah, good question. And the short answer is yes, there is no requirement for geospatial data in ArcGIS. It happens to be an example I use a lot because I come from the geospatial world, but it's not a requirement. In ArcGIS for Science and the example I showed with ArcGIS as a digital image cataloging package, really kind of both, I think, speak to that. We do include in ArcGIS a data type, which we call an annotation data type, that allows you to interact with images and mark up or annotate images in a way that's kind of an analog to maps. So if you think about putting a location of a resource on a map, you could also think about describing aspects of an object by annotating its image. And ArcGIS for Science definitely includes that data type and some plugins specifically designed to ease the process of managing images, for example. So I guess my bottom line is you don't feel like you're limited. ArcGIS does not require, nor should you feel limited to only using it for geospatially referenced data.
I agree, Dennis. We have many of our implementations include resource models or model data that has no georeferencing at all. So any resources having to do with people, there's intangible heritage that others are building models for. And so it really, if you think of the geospatial capabilities as an aspect of the data management, it is just one aspect. There are so many other aspects that you can manage in regards to your resources and the types of resources that you have. There's another part of this question that I wanted to address regarding that digital photo collection, and I'm assuming you're talking about the Ruche project. And note that that's an interesting one, because we're not sure if that package will necessarily be available. We hope it will, but that project that feeds into a different front end. So you might not necessarily get the front end of what the visualization of that, but you will get how they modeled the data that is used to power that front end site. Okay.
All right. Let's see. Dennis, I'm wondering whether, I don't see another question yet, but I'm wondering if you could speak to any specific ways out in the community that you've seen people exploring working with those dashboards and live data feeds.
Yeah, that's a really good question, David. One of the things we're seeing is this desire to use ArcGIS not only to manage not only cultural heritage resources or other resources, but also data feeds that might be relevant to those resources. And I'm thinking specifically of a project in China, in Gansu province, near the Dongwang cave complex, where they deployed ArcGIS to manage information about their caves, these Buddhist caves, and related cultural heritage resources, and then have integrated into ArcGIS live feeds that describe, like in some cases, the CO2 concentration inside one of the caves, or expected weather, like wind direction and precipitation, so that, or also the number of visitors at a site, so that they have a way of managing not only the cultural heritage resource itself, but potential impacts on that resource. And what they've done is integrate live data feeds into ArcGIS as, in one case, as a plugin. So that's definitely a way to integrate ArcGIS with telemetry data. Another way, which I hinted at in today's conversation, was to integrate a dashboarding technology. And the technology that we use and support is a technology called Kibana. It happens to be directly in a direct application that's directly related to the search engine that ArcGIS uses, which is Elasticsearch. So this is a technology that provides authoring services for creating data visualizations that are real time and that support statistical analysis, statistical aggregations of information, and as a way of supporting feeds from multiple applications, and not just ArcGIS, into an information display platform. And if you're at all interested, you can find out a lot about Kibana by going to the Elastic website and just typing in Kibana, K-I-B-A-N-A, and it'll give you a lot of information about how you can take advantage of this data presentation and publishing platform.
Great. We have one more question in, and it's thanks for the informative and quite fun presentation. I know that Global Digital Heritage has been using ArcGIS reporting for metadata of 3D objects, which is quite inspiring. Is there any plan on BIM or building information modeling, environment package development, or 3D annotation tools?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to speak for them, and I would definitely encourage that question be directed specifically to them. But I will say that one of the things that the ArcGIS for Science package includes is the ability to manage, at least upload and present, display three-dimensional models. So those could be really quite diverse. I mean, they could be point clouds, so LiDAR-based point clouds. They could be models. They can models of structures, models of works of art, models of molecules. It's quite flexible. So this idea of at least accessing and managing and presenting three-dimensional data is definitely something that we're thinking about in the ArcGIS for Science package.
And just to add to that, I think this will be our last question, that while Farallon Geographics is are the lead developers on the ArcGIS platform, they are not the only developers, and ArcGIS is open source software. So anyone, any organization, any person in the community can develop develop their own modules, develop their own plugins, develop any functionality to add to ArcGIS. And the only stipulation there is that that enhancement gets shared with the rest of the community. And it's one of the reasons why, as Dennis mentioned, ArcGIS was built in such a modular way so that others in the community can easily add to the functionality of the software.
Yeah, this is, I think, really a super important point, and one that I wish I'd made a little bit more strongly or at all, and that is you don't need us or the Getty or anyone to build an application. You can do it yourself. You have everything you need to implement ArcGIS in exactly the way you want and extend it in exactly the way you want to. Essentially, you don't need our permission. You're free to take the Lego kit and build whatever you want with it.
Looks like I spoke too soon. There is one more question, and that's from Clive Boardman. Thanks for the presentation. I would like to ask, I don't think it's an idiot question. Can you list some advantages and disadvantages of using ArcGIS versus a standard GIS? Dennis, you can go ahead and answer that, but I will say that there are many advantages, and they're different things. ArcGIS is not necessarily a standard GIS, and Dennis, you can go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so we could have a whole webinar just to answer this question, and that might be fun to do, actually. I'll just say there's some. So let's talk about the advantages of ArcGIS. The first is it offers all the geospatial capabilities that you might want or need to manage your geodata within ArcGIS. And it does that on top of a specific technology called PostGIS. And you'll have noticed I purposely didn't talk about technology today. I talked about information architecture. The bottom line is ArcGIS includes a fully featured geospatial data management, data processing system. And so in many ways, you can do exactly the same things within ArcGIS as you could do within, say, Esri. So I think puts it at least on par. ArcGIS has a different model for how it builds data, how it organizes data. And forgive me if this becomes too technical too quickly, but ArcGIS doesn't think of the world as a series of layers. ArcGIS thinks of the world as a series of attributes. And one model can have multiple geometric attributes associated with it. And each of those attributes can be defined to include multiple geometry primitives, so like point signs and polygons. Whereas in the Esri world, you create a feature class, and that's conceived of as a layer with a specific kind of geometry. So if you wanted to use multiple geometries to represent a single thing, like buildings, you essentially need multiple feature classes. So there's some pros and cons to that. I'll just boil it down to, I think ArcGIS has a more flexible data model, which gives you a lot more latitude in how you describe real world features and resources. And there's a benefit to that. There's also a cost of that, which means that when you talk about integrating ArcGIS with other systems, you have to think about how to turn it back into a flat model of the world. And there's some effort in that. The bottom line is that's all doable. I think our ArcGIS Esri add-in demonstrates that. And ultimately, my goal for ArcGIS, at least in the geospatial sense, is that it should work in a seamless way with other geospatial technologies, whether that's QGIS or Esri or Mapbox or Google Maps or really any of these technologies. It's meant to be a first-class playmate with all the other technologies out there. And if that's too glossy of an answer, I'd be happy to take this discussion offline and we can talk about some of the real technical details in more depth.
Yeah. And Dennis, to add to what you said, coming from the non-GIS perspective, really, when you're looking at ArcGIS, you're not bound by, and Dennis said this in a different way, but you are not bound by describing the world according to, in a georeferenced way. That was part of Masood's question. So if you have, if you're describing cultural heritage or any other type of project or any type of other type of resources that don't have a geospatial component, you are able to do that with a lot more freedom than you would if you were using a standard GIS. So that is definitely something to note. But as Dennis mentioned, we definitely could have a whole webinar on that. Hopefully that begins to answer your question, Clive. And I think we don't have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar for now. Thank you all for attending, and we'll be back with another webinar soon. And just be sure to sign up for our mailing lists, sign up for the forum, and also our different social media channels to stay on top of when our next webinar will take place. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.